At 35,000 feet above the ground, power can feel absolute. One uniform, one decision, one quiet judgment that changes everything. A young black student steps onto a flight believing he has earned his place, only to be stopped by a moment that feels far too familiar. Dismissive eyes, cold authority, and a seat suddenly declared not meant for him. What begins as a routine flight quickly turns into a test of dignity, identity, and unseen truth. Because the man being judged carries a secret no one expects, and when that truth comes out, everything changes. But how far can one moment of bias really go before it collapses? Before that flight, his life followed a quiet rhythm built on discipline and restraint. He was a black college student who had learned early how to move through the world without drawing attention, not because he lacked confidence, but because experience had taught him caution. He studied hard, traveled often for academic programs, and believed in preparation over entitlement. Airports, planes, long lines, and waiting areas were familiar territory. He knew the rules, followed them closely, and never expected special treatment. His appearance was neat but modest. Nothing about him screamed wealth or power. He dressed like someone focused on purpose rather than perception. To strangers, he looked like any other student juggling deadlines and expectations, carrying dreams heavier than his luggage. What most people didn't see was the pressure he carried, the unspoken need to constantly prove he belonged in spaces where he was often questioned without words. This trip mattered more than most. It wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about arriving ready, focused, and on time. First class wasn't a privilege he flaunted. It was simply what had been booked, paid for, and confirmed. Still, experience had taught him that confirmation didn't always guarantee acceptance. As he moved through the terminal, small moments began to feel off. Lingering glances, subtle shifts in tone, the kind of unease that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles deep in the chest. He brushed it aside, reminding himself that assumptions don't always turn into actions. But sometimes, all it takes is one gate, one uniform, and one decision to turn quiet tension into something impossible to ignore. And as he approached the aircraft door, that unspoken tension was about to become very real. The moment his boarding pass was scanned, the air around him shifted. What should have been routine turned tense in an instant. The flight attendant's posture changed, her attention lingering longer than necessary. Her eyes moved from the screen to his face, then to his clothes, then back again, as if something about him didn't fit the picture she had already formed in her mind. Passengers behind him waited, unaware that a silent judgment was unfolding at the door of the aircraft. He was told to step aside. Confusion hit first, then disbelief. His seat was valid. His ticket was clear. Yet suddenly, there was an issue that seemed to exist only because he did. The explanation offered was vague, wrapped in authority but empty of logic. First class, he was made to feel, wasn't meant for someone like him. The words didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The message was loud in its silence. As time stretched, eyes began to turn. A few passengers glanced away quickly, uncomfortable but relieved not to be involved. Others stared openly, curiosity mixing with quiet judgment. Each second standing there felt heavier than the last. He could feel the familiar tightening in his chest, the internal calculation he had learned over years. How to stay calm, how not to appear threatening, how to protect his dignity without making things worse. The attendant double-checked systems that didn't need checking. She examined details that had already been confirmed. Each delay felt intentional, as if waiting long enough might force him to give up, to accept embarrassment quietly and move on. But he didn't. He stood still, grounded, refusing to shrink, even as the space around him seemed to close in. What made it worse wasn't just the denial, it was the implication. That he was trying to take something that didn't belong to him, that he was out of place, that his presence in first class required justification beyond a valid ticket. The injustice burned quietly, not explosive, but sharp and persistent. Inside the cabin, first-class seats remained empty. The plane was waiting. Yet the problem remained unresolved, suspended in that charged moment where power was being tested. The attendant's confidence began to harden, as if challenged simply by his refusal to disappear. Authority doesn't like being questioned, especially when it believes it cannot be wrong. Then something unexpected happened. A subtle shift in procedure, a call placed, a name requested. The tone changed, not softer, but more cautious. The energy around the gate tightened, as if everyone sensed that this situation was no longer as simple as it first appeared. What had begun as a quiet act of discrimination was now inching towards something far bigger. Because the longer this delay lasted, the clearer it became that denying him his seat might come at a cost no one had anticipated. And as the truth edged closer to the surface, one question lingered in the air. Who was really about to be exposed when this situation finally unraveled? The tension reached its breaking point when the delay could no longer be justified. The aircraft door stood open, the cabin silent, and the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone involved. What had started as a quiet denial had now grown into an undeniable confrontation with truth. Systems were checked again, procedures escalated higher than intended, and attention shifted beyond the gate. The authority that once felt unshakable began to show cracks. The student stood motionless, carrying the full force of the moment. Every second felt like an accusation aimed at his existence in that space. He felt the familiar mix of anger and restraint battling inside him. The urge to defend himself against something so unfair, and the knowledge that reacting could make everything worse. This was no longer about a seat. It was about being seen as worthy of respect. Then the truth surfaced. The identity behind his last name, once irrelevant, now carried weight. Not privilege flaunted, but reality exposed. The room changed instantly. What had been suspicion turned into shock. What had been confidence, hardened by bias, dissolved into uncertainty. The same authority that questioned his presence now scrambled to contain the consequences of its assumptions. In that moment, the injustice stood naked. The denial was no longer defensible. It was clear, undeniable, and impossible to explain away. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision rooted in perception, not policy. And now, everyone could see it. The power dynamic flipped without a word needing to be spoken. The student, once made to feel small, now stood at the center of a reckoning far larger than himself. The silence grew heavier, not with accusation, but with realization. A realization that this moment would not disappear quietly. Because when bias is exposed under bright lights, it doesn't just affect one person. It leaves a mark on everyone who witnesses it. And as the situation finally tipped beyond control, one truth became unavoidable. This flight would never be remembered for where it was headed, but for what it revealed. In the end, the seat was no longer the point. The incident resolved not with celebration, but with a quiet gravity that lingered long after the aircraft doors finally closed. The student took his place carrying more than relief. He carried the weight of what had been revealed. Not just about him, but about how quickly dignity can be questioned when skin color becomes the lens through which worth is measured. What stayed with him wasn't anger alone, but clarity. He had followed every rule, met every requirement, and still had to stand and prove he belonged. The outcome didn't erase the humiliation or the moment of doubt planted in his chest. It simply confirmed something many already know, but rarely see exposed so clearly. Bias doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't need evidence to act. For those who witnessed it, the silence afterward was louder than any apology. It was the sound of realization settling in, the uncomfortable truth that discrimination often hides behind procedure, authority, and routine checks. And that without accountability, it repeats itself on countless flights, offices, classrooms, and public spaces every single day. For the student, the experience became a turning point, not because power intervened, but because truth surfaced. It reinforced a painful reality. Respect should never depend on who you know, how much you have, or what your last name means. Equality loses its meaning the moment it must be proven. This story isn't rare, it's just rarely acknowledged, and that's what makes it dangerous. So the question remains, how many people without a hidden safety net are forced to accept moments like this in silence? And how many times do we look away, relieved it isn't happening to us? Until those questions make us uncomfortable enough to act, the injustice will keep finding new places to land.